You ever walk into a room and feel something shift in your chest? Like a quiet pressure that doesn't belong to you. The laughter in the corner seems hollow. The silence in someone's gaze, too loud. And even though no one says it out loud, you feel it. You always feel it. It's not intuition. It's not magic. It's something more ancient than both. And the truth is, most of the world has no idea what that something is. They call you sensitive. They say you care too much. You nod. You smile. But inside, you're carrying a weight you can't name. Let me ask you something. Do you ever feel tired after doing nothing but listening? Do you cry over stories that don't belong to you? Do you sometimes love people you know are hurting you? Because their pain feels familiar. They told you empathy was a gift, but they never told you it could turn into a trap. I'm not here to flatter your sensitivity. I'm here to name what no one warned you about. Empathy is not a greeting card. It's not soft music and warm hands. Empathy, real, archetypal empathy is dangerous. It's the open gate to the underworld. It's the call of the unseen. It's the soul of the world, using your body to scream. And if you don't understand that, if you don't learn the difference between compassion and possession, you won't just feel others. You'll become them. And slowly, quietly, you'll disappear. This is not a gentle story, but it might just be the one that helps you finally come home to yourself. I didn't always know what was happening to me. There were days I'd wake up heavy, like I'd cried in my sleep. But I hadn't. I'd dream of strangers, people I'd never met, begging, whispering, bleeding emotions through symbols I didn't understand. I'd walk through my day like a ghost magnet. People would sit next to me and suddenly start confessing things, dark things, shameful things, beautiful things. And I'd nod, and I'd feel it all, as if their stories were ink seeping into the paper of my soul. For years I thought this meant I was kind, compassionate, special, maybe. But the truth is, I didn't know the first thing about boundaries, or about the deep psychic truth Carl Jung whispered beneath all his theories, that the unconscious is real, that it acts through us, that empathy is not just feeling what others feel, it is a portal, and portals are meant to be guarded. When you're empathic, you're not just a nice person. You're a lightning rod, a receptor, a channel through which other people's shadow can pass. And if no one has taught you how to discern, how to seal your energy, how to face your own reflection without absorbing everyone else's, then you're not feeling, you're fusing. This video isn't about making you feel special for being sensitive. It's about giving language to the thing you've never been able to name. It's about walking into the cave and not becoming the cave. Because if you don't learn to differentiate what's yours from what's theirs, you'll be haunted by feelings you never invited in. The empath is a vessel, not a sponge. It took me years to understand that not every ache in my chest belonged to me. I remember the first time I truly noticed it. I was in a cafe. Nothing dramatic, just coffee and quiet chatter. But suddenly, my hands were trembling. My eyes welled up. No one had said a word to me. And yet, there it was, grief, like a storm pressing into my ribs from the inside out. Later, I learned the woman behind me had just lost her husband. She never spoke to me, but I felt her sorrow like it was written in my bones. That's when I realized, this isn't just emotion, it's transmission. See, when people talk about empaths, they picture gentle souls holding someone's hand, saying, I understand. But that's a greeting card. The real empath, they don't just understand. They embody, they don't just hear your sadness. They carry it, not metaphorically, psychically. And that's where the danger begins, because the unconscious doesn't send polite invitations. It floods, and if you're open unguarded, you becomes its host. Carl Jung wrote of this when he spoke about the ego being overtaken by the unconscious. That when we're not aware, we become puppets, animated by energies that aren't ours. I once dreamt of a woman standing on a rope bridge over a chasm. She had no eyes, Her hands were outstretched, trembling. Below her voices, cries, shadowy figures reaching up from the darkness. She was absorbing it all, but she didn't know where the pain ended, and she began. That is the empath's dilemma. We confuse compassion with fusion. We think our ability to feel deeply is noble, but deep feeling without discernment, it's psychic drowning. There's an old-school teaching from Taoist philosophy. Water shapes its container. Beautiful, right. But if the container has no shape, the water spills, it seeps, it erodes, and that's what happens to the empath without structure. They become formless, a sponge in a storm, but you were never meant to be a sponge. You were meant to be a vessel, a conscious container strong enough to hold space, but wise enough to know what's not theirs to carry. You ever wonder why you're exhausted after being with certain people? Or why you suddenly feel angry for no reason? That's not just mood, it's absorption. And if you don't learn to distinguish it, you'll burn out. Or worse, you'll begin to believe all that emotion is you. Here's a strange fact I stumbled across. There are sea creatures called tunicates as larvae. They swim freely, exploring, but once they find a rock, they anchor and digest their own brain. No longer needing to move, they become static living filters. Some empaths do this metaphorically. They stop questioning. They stop sensing what's theirs. They park themselves in others' pain and slowly digest their own awareness, because it's easier to feel for others than to feel the vast, wild unknown inside themselves. And yet, the calling remains. The true empath isn't here to dissolve. They're here to transmute. They're not martyrs. They're mystics in training. But first, they must remember, you are not here to absorb. You are here to hold, to honor, and to return. Let that be your beginning. The psychic currents beneath feelings. Some feelings aren't yours. Let that settle in for a moment. Because for most empaths, the reflex is instant feel it. Name it. Own it. But sometimes what you call sadness isn't personal. Sometimes that anxiety, that shame, that sudden wave of hopelessness, it's archetypal. Carl Jung called the unconscious a collective ocean, vast and older than our personal stories. And when you're empathic, you're not just tapping into another person's mood, you're plugging into the archetypal electricity that animates them. You're not just feeling their grief, you're touching the grief of generations behind them. It's wild, I know, but you've probably felt it already without the words to explain. You meet someone, and within minutes, it's like you've known them forever. You get flashes, images, impressions. You feel their guilt, their hunger for forgiveness, their fear of being forgotten, and you think it's just chemistry. But what if it's more than that? What if it's your unconscious recognizing the myth playing out in them? Years ago, I read an African tribal story that hit me like a freight train. A young dreamer would walk the forest's edge and feel waves of emotion crash over him. Terror, longing, rage. Not his. No reason. Just feelings. The village feared he was possessed. But the elder didn't perform an exorcism. He taught him to name the spirits. That was the cure. Name the feeling. Recognize it as a visitor, not a home. There's deep wisdom in that. When we don't name what we carry, we become what we carry. I once saw this play out in therapy. A client, a brilliant teacher, came to me weeping. She said she felt broken, that her students' pain clung to her like second skin. She'd come home numb, angry, or deeply depressed. But after a year of inner work, we uncovered a startling dream she'd carried since childhood. In it, she stood in a cathedral made entirely of mirrors. Each mirror reflected not herself, but someone else's anguish. And no matter where she turned, she could never find her own face. It broke her heart, and it healed her, because for the first time, she saw the metaphor. She had become a vessel of everyone else's reflection, but she didn't know her own. This is the psychic danger of unguarded empathy. You become a collage of everyone else's pain. but without integration, you become a ghost inside yourself. Here's the academic wrinkle most people miss. Jung's concept of projection isn't just you see in others what's in you. It also works in reverse. Others project into you, and if you're open, unguarded, they will unconsciously deposit their unlived sorrow, ungrieved grief, untamed rage right into you. You're the soft landing, the archetypal receptacle. You ever wonder why, sometimes, people seem relieved just by being around you? It's because they've offloaded psychic material without knowing it, and you leave that room with a headache or a mysterious tightness in your chest. Here's a strange tangent. Did you know elephants can detect thunderstorms hundreds of miles away through vibrations in the ground, or they feel it in their feet? Empaths are like that. They pick up what's coming long before it arrives. But that doesn't mean they're meant to carry the storm. They're meant to recognize it, witness it, and then walk on. That's the difference between psychic fusion and psychic discernment. One drowns you, the other initiates you. So ask yourself, when you feel something, do you ask where it came from? Do you pause long enough to ask, is this mine? If not, you might be standing in a storm that never belonged to you, and your healing begins the moment you choose to step out of the rain. When helping becomes possession, I've seen it happen more times than I can count. An empath falls in love with someone broken, and not just romantically. This could be a friend, a sibling, even a client. They feel the person's wounds so deeply. They mistake that feeling for connection. They don't mean to. They think they're helping, but they're not. They're merging. And that, my friend, is where empathy turns from sacred into something far more sinister. You see, the unconscious is a trickster. It doesn't always show up with horns and flames. Sometimes it arrives in the shape of a need to help, so overwhelming, so noble, it blinds you to your own erosion. Carl Jung spoke of enantiodromia, the reversal into the opposite. And this is one of empathy's most dangerous reversals. The healer becomes the harmed. The light-bearer becomes the host of another's shadow. The savior becomes the sacrifice. I once worked with a man, let's call him Daniel. He was a therapist, brilliant, warm, devoted, and completely consumed by the suffering of others. One of his clients, a young woman with a history of trauma, began calling him outside of sessions, texting him, depending on him. He wanted to help. He had to help. And before he realized it, his days were no longer his. Her grief was his insomnia. Her panic attacks were pulsing in his bloodstream. He wasn't helping. He was being possessed. And that's the danger. Because when the unconscious archetype of the wounded healer rises without your awareness, when Chiron, the mythical centaur who could heal others but not himself, animates you, you stop being a person, you become a role, and roles don't rest. Roles don't say no. Roles don't have boundaries. This is where the empathic impulse mutates from care into control. You start believing that unless you show up, everything will fall apart. You mistake being needed for being loved. You confuse exhaustion with virtue. Here's a hard truth wrapped in an odd image. In medieval times, physicians would bleed patients to release illness, but many bled them so frequently, they weakened them further. That's what unconscious empaths do. They keep opening their emotional veins, bleeding out, thinking it's healing. It's not. It's spiritual anemia. I had a woman tell me once, I just want to be loved for who I am, not for what I give. And yet she never stopped giving, because somewhere deep inside, she was terrified that without her empathy, she'd be invisible. Sound familiar? You ever wonder if your value is tied to your capacity to carry others? You ever feel guilty not helping? That's not empathy, that's a possession. Here's where the academic lens returns. When Jungians talk about archetypal inflation, they mean you become taken over by something larger than yourself, like a myth walking in your shoes. The martyr, the mother, The rescuer. You no longer act. You are acted through. That's why it's so hard to stop, to say, this isn't mine to carry, because it feels like betrayal. But I'll say this slowly. And with love, helping someone is not the same as healing them. Being present is not the same as being consumed. Your light is meant to illuminate, not burn you alive. So ask yourself, does your empathy uplift, or does it entrap? Do you witness, or do you fuse? Because if helping someone else always leaves you empty, that's not empathy, that's abandonment of yourself. Empathy without boundaries is contagion. There's a quiet line we cross. It doesn't shout. It doesn't leave scars, but it hollows us from the inside out. It's the line between compassion and contagion. You don't realize you've crossed it until you start waking up with aches you can't explain. Until people call you strong and you start resenting them for it. Until your smile becomes a mask and your silence becomes heavy, not peaceful, and you wonder, when did my empathy become the reason I'm always tired? The answer, when it lost its borders. I used to think boundaries were selfish. I really did. I thought saying no meant I wasn't loving enough. That holding space meant holding everything. But here's the truth. I learned the hard way. Empathy without boundaries isn't love, it's self-erasure. Here's something odd. In virology, there's a term, pathogen spillover. It happens when a virus jumps from one species to another. Usually, it requires close proximity, weakened immunity, and lack of protective barriers. Sounds familiar? Unconscious empathy works the same way. You sit too close to someone's sorrow without grounding yourself, and it jumps. Their despair, their trauma, their guilt suddenly becomes yours. You think you're supporting them, but what you're really doing is absorbing them, and no one's better for it. I once had a patient, a nurse, whose dream haunted her for months. She was walking through a war zone, but the bodies weren't just on the ground. They were attached to her, clinging, whispering, asking for help. She tried to run, but with every step, more hands grabbed at her legs. She screamed, "I'm trying," but they didn't let go. That's what happens when your empathy doesn't have form. You become the battlefield. You don't witness suffering. You become the shrine it bleeds on. Let me say this clearly. There is no spiritual prize for carrying everyone else's pain. You are not a better human for bleeding on behalf of others. You are simply bleeding. There's an academic concept I love from family systems theory, differentiation of self. It's the ability to stay emotionally connected to others without fusing with their experience. It's how you hold someone's story with compassion without losing your own narrative. You ever notice how the most grounded people can sit beside sorrow and somehow remain whole? It's not detachment, it's boundaries. Sacred ones, not the cold, defensive walls we build when we're afraid, but the clear, soulful lines that say, "I am with you, but I am not you." In one of Jung's letters, he said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." And I believe the same applies to empathy until you've seen where it becomes toxic, where it becomes a mask for control, where it becomes a way to avoid facing your own shadow. You haven't really embodied it. Empathy, in its truest form, requires sovereignty, because without it, you are no longer a healer. You are a contagion point, a relay station for unprocessed energy that was never yours. Here's something strange and beautiful. In some indigenous traditions, there's a role called the pain eater. They don't literally eat pain. They transmute it, but only after undergoing rigorous personal purification. You can't alchemize what you haven't first purified within yourself. So ask, are you absorbing or are you transmuting? Are you helping or are you harboring? Because if you're drowning in the pain of others, maybe it's time to swim back to shore and reclaim your name before you forget who you were, before you started bleeding for everyone else. The initiation of the conscious empath, somewhere along the way. I realized I was no longer living. I was reacting to everything. Someone else's tears could send me spiraling. A stranger's silence could keep me up at night, and I called it empathy. But it was exhaustion in disguise. That's when the real work began. You see, the unconscious empath is like a hallway with all the doors open. No filter, no gatekeeper. Every emotion, every shadow, every whisper from someone else's soul just walks right in. But the conscious empath, they start closing doors, not out of fear, but out of discernment. Carl Jung called this individuation the process of becoming your true self, not a role, not a reflection, but a full, rooted being. And for the empath, individuation means facing a terrifying truth. You can't save everyone, and you're not supposed to. That urge to fix, that drive to carry, sometimes it's not compassion, sometimes it's a mask to hide your fear of being alone, of being unneeded, of being still long enough to feel your own ache. I had to face that in myself. I had to look into the mirror and ask, what part of me feels important when I'm rescuing someone? What part of me is afraid that if I set boundaries, no one will love me? It's not pretty, it's not poetic, but it's honest, and that's where transformation begins. There's an image from a dream that guided me once. A woman standing in a storm. Around her, lightning and wailing winds, but she wasn't panicking. She held a bowl, simple, wooden, carved with ancient symbols. In it, her own tears. She knelt down, whispered to the wind, and poured the tears into the soil, not to drown it, but to feed it. That is the conscious empath. They don't absorb storms. They speak with them. They offer only what is truly theirs. Odd fact, in Japanese forest mythology, there's a belief in Kodama spirits that echo the energy of those who enter. They don't interfere. They reflect. They respond to integrity. The conscious empath becomes something similar. A mirror, a presence, a tuning fork for truth. Not for chaos, but to become that. You have to confront your own shadow. Not just the wounds, but the parts of you that like being the wounded one. The part that gets to say, no one else understands like I do. The part that secretly feels holy when it hurts. This is the alchemical fire, where empathy is burned, purified, and reforged. This is the moment you stop asking, how can I help? And start asking, who am I without the helping? That's where your center waits. That's where sovereignty lives. And with sovereignty comes clarity. Suddenly, you're not walking into rooms scanning for who's in pain. You're walking in as yourself, fully. And from that rooted place, your empathy becomes radiant, not leaking, not grasping, but luminous. This is what the mystics knew. That presence is medicine, not performance, not sacrifice. Presence, pure, anchored, and free. So if you're tired of bleeding for every soul you meet, maybe it's time to descend into your own cave. Not to find a wound, but to recover yourself. That's the beginning of real power, not in how much you feel, but in how well you remain whole, while feeling, becoming a mirror for potential, not pain. There comes a moment in every empath's journey where the mirror finally clears. And for the first time, you don't just see pain. You see possibility. I remember the exact moment it happened to me. I was sitting with a friend who had spent years entangled in toxic relationships. She was crying again over the same man, the same wound. Usually, I'd lean in, offer comfort, soak it in. But this time, something shifted. I didn't collapse into her pain. I didn't try to rescue. I saw her, and I said, I trust your strength more than your story. She looked at me confused, but in her silence, I felt it. The mirror had changed, no longer a sponge. I had become a reflection, not of her suffering, but of her soul. And that, my friend, is what the conscious empath becomes. A vessel of potential, not pathology. Carl Jung once wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And when you finally become the self, rooted and intact, you stop being seduced by brokenness. You start being called toward truth. This doesn't mean you stop caring. Quite the opposite. You love deeper, more powerfully. But you no longer mistake chaos for intimacy. You no longer fuse with the fire just to prove you care. Here's an offbeat fact. There are lakes in Antarctica, buried beneath miles of ice, that haven't seen sunlight for millions of years. And yet, life still exists there. That's what lives inside the soul of the matured empath. Depth, stillness, self-sustaining integrity. Even in darkness, they hold light. But there's a temptation here. A new archetype rises. The magician, the one who sees beneath masks, who understands energy, emotion, archetype, who speaks shadow fluently. And that's beautiful, unless it turns into seduction. I've seen it happen. Empaths who awaken, who become powerful, then start manipulating. They weaponize insight. They hide control behind care. They wear wisdom like a costume. And in doing so, they become what they once feared. That's why vigilance is necessary. Because growth doesn't end at awakening. It begins there. The conscious empath is not a performer of light. They are a guardian of soul. They don't scan for brokenness. They invite remembrance. They don't say, "Let me fix you." They say, "I see who you could become." They don't merge. They mirror, and that's the most loving thing you can do. Because there is no freedom in fusion, only loss. But in reflection, there is power, there is presence, there is peace. I once dreamt of a figure, silent, still, standing at the edge of a silver lake. People approached one by one, each expecting answers, but the figure said nothing. And somehow, each person walked away, changed, not because they were told what to be, but because they saw what they could become. This, I believe, is the destiny of the conscious empath, not to carry the wounded, but to reflect the sacred, to walk not as a savior, but as a signal, a reminder that feeling does not require fusion, that love does not require loss, that presence is enough. You no longer need to break yourself to serve others. You need only to be whole, and from that wholeness, true compassion flows. To witness, not to bleed. So much of our world celebrates sensitivity, but almost none of it teaches us how to survive it. You've been told you're a gift. You've been praised for your softness, your insight, your care, but no one warned you what it costs. No one warned you that empathy real, raw, soul-deep empathy can hollow you out, that it can steal your name, that it can wrap you in shadows that don't belong to you and convince you they're yours. But now, you know, and knowing is the beginning of becoming. The truth is, you were never meant to carry it all. You were meant to see it, to honor it, and to choose, to feel wisely, to love with clarity, to help without merging. You don't have to bleed to be good. You don't have to be needed to be whole. You don't have to absorb pain to prove you're compassionate. There's a different way, a quieter, stronger, deeper way. It begins with presence, with sovereignty, with learning how to sit beside someone's grief without drowning in it, to say, "I feel you, but I do not become you." That is sacred, that is mature, that is healing. So if you've recognized yourself in these words, if you've seen the shadow in your gift and the gold in your wounds, then let this be your mirror. Not a mirror for your pain, but for your possibility. You are not broken. You are not too much. You are not here to disappear into everyone else. You are here to stand, to reflect, to witness, to remain. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope today you find a quiet corner to continue that silent conversation with yourself. And don't forget to subscribe. There are many more videos to come about dreams, the shadow, and the hidden corners of the soul waiting for you ahead.